Hi all, welcome to module P10. In this module, we'll be looking at how we can connect our web app to the database, and we'll also be doing a small introduction to SQL injection. So far we've understood how to do basic data modeling and how to use a DBMS. We've also built a web app that takes data from an object inside the source code of the web app and uses the data inside that object to create templates so that it can render pages dynamically. We've also understood that we need to separate data and code concerns and why a database is required for a typical web application. We're going to now take this combined knowledge and actually build an application that connects to the database. So the first thing that we need to do is go clean up our database and remove all the tables so that we can start from afresh. We'll have to connect our web app to the database. So for that, we'll be using the Node Postgres package, also known as the PG package on NPM. We'll be using that to help us connect to the database. So let's head to our coding console. Now what we want to do here is connect to the database, and to test that out, let's say that we're going to go to a particular endpoint, and on this endpoint we want to see that we're able to make a select request and return a response with the results, right? So let's head to our database, and I've cleaned up my database, so there's no tables here. Let me just quickly create a table called test, and let's say that has an ID, which is an integer, and a name, which is some kind of a text field. So let's save this. Right, let's make ID the primary key. Let's add an item here. Right, so we've got two items here. Now what we're going to do is try to connect to this database. So we're going to use the Node Postgres package, and the best way to do this is to quickly go to the documentation. So if you go to the Node Postgres GitHub page, you'll see that there's something called a wiki, and they have examples written here. So let's look at the example app, right? So the way they ask us to use the Postgres library is to make a connection pool, and after creating connection pool, create a database configuration. Right? The database configuration contains the host name, the username, the password, the database, and then make a request. Right? So let's try to do the same thing. Let's create a pool. Right, and after we make a pool, we need to create a configuration. So let's create a var config. So we need to have a user field. Now we know that our user is Coco98. We can have the database field. We know that our database is also Coco98. Now we would like to have the host, which is the host where the DBMS is hosted. So that's db.imad.hasura.app.io. We know that the port is 5432. Now we need the password of the database. Now if we enter the password here, then anybody who has access to our source code will be able to access this password. So we can use an environment variable, and you can read up on how environment variables work, but the idea is that when you deploy this code on the server, the IMAD hosting environment makes sure that this environment variable is available for you to inject into your app. So that means that when your code is deployed, at that time this environment variable will be available, and to access this environment variable we need to say process.env. So this line of code says that use the environment variable that is available called db password, right? So it will use this password. Now let's go back to our testdb function. Now let's add this code. So note this instruction that the connection pool is created outside the server request, so that the connection pool is created as soon as the app is started and not when a new connection happens. So let's copy this code. So that means our pool is now ready. Now we're going to make a query. So pool.query select star from test, and once we have the result, so in case we have an error, we return a 500 status code and we say that we'll make the error available, right? And in case there's no error, then we would like to send the result as a JSON string, right? So let's see what this looks like. Let's commit this. So I'll go to our application. Let's go to testdb, and you can see that the output and our result is here. So you can see that 2 rows are available, right? So in the object that is returned by the database, we have the command, we have the row count that tells us 2 rows have been selected, and we have the actual rows, which is an array of objects, right? So if we want to just get the array of objects, we can do result.rows. And then you can see that just the rows have been made available, right? So now let's use this idea and try to change our articles function, that instead of having this gigantic articles object, we just load the articles from the database. So the first thing that we need to do is model this data, right? So that this is the object that we want. So let's try to make sure that we can capture this data in our database. So I head to my database and I'm going to create a new table. I'm going to create a table called article. So every article has an ID, which is an integer, which I will auto increment. I'll have a title, which is what appears in the URL bar. And then I'll have the heading. I'll have a date. So heading is text. Date I can create as a date type. And content is text. So let's just check if that is all the fields. We have title, heading, date, and content. We have 4 here, and we have ID, which we can use as a primary key. So let's quickly set that as a primary key. And let's add a value there. So let's leave this as default. It will automatically choose a particular value. Let's say this is article 1, and let's set the date to 2016. 0601, right? And let's set the content to be testing the database, right? So let's save this. Save has gone through. Now let's try to replace this article in our code, right? So what we'll do is I'm going to change the endpoint to be /articles/. So that means that /article/article1 is going to render article 1. Now this part of the function will stay the same because this is templating that particular data. So we don't have to change the create template function, but we need to change the data that we're getting, right? So what we need to do is that we need something called the article data object, and assuming that we have the article data object, which somehow contains the value from the database, we're going to replace it here. So let's do that first, right? Now our job is to try to get the article data object, right? So let's leave this and let's make a similar query to what we had. So let's say pool.query select star from article where title equal to, right? And now we want to get the title, which is the article name. So this is article 1. We want to find out where title equal to article 1, get that particular object and display it here. So whenever we have a string in SQL, we have to use single quotes to match. But since we're already using single quotes for a JavaScript string, we can't do that. So let's convert the JavaScript string to double quotes. And we effectively want to do something like this, right? But this value is going to come from the parameter. So it will be rec.params.article name, right? So we're going to use the same article name here, right? And we use that here to select the particular article. And let's say that once we get the result, let's define what we want to do with the result. Again, if there is an error, so let's handle the error by right? So we'll display the error, and in case there's no error, it's still possible that when we tried to fetch this, there was no title that existed. So that means that if result.rows.length is equal to 0, then in that case we should say 404. That means that we didn't find the resource that was being requested, and we'll say article not found. But in case we do have something, then we'll say article data is equal to result.rows of 0, right, which is the first element. And now that we have the article data, we can template it, right? So let's see this in action. Let's go to /articles/article1, right? So the error that I'm getting is that column 1 does not exist, which means that somehow 1 is being interpreted as if it's a column name, right? And if we go back here, you can see that what's happening is that it's saying this query is coming up as something like select star from article where title equal to article 1. And what is happening is that it's taking 1 as a column, and that's because this is coming up as the minus operator, right? So it's thinking this is a minus operator and it's trying to subtract 2 values. So what we need to do is to make sure that this is around a single quote, right? This is what we want to do. So what we're going to do is we'll add a single quote here and make sure that we close a single quote here, right? So now this string will be equivalent to what we want here, right? So let's save this and see what we get. There we go, and our article 1 is loaded. If you look at the date format, it's printing out the entire date, right? And that's because the date object is being rendered as a JavaScript date object. So to convert that into just date, we can use toDate string, right? So let's see what that looks like. And you can see that it looks much neater. So that means that we've now connected to a database and we're able to load data here. So let's quickly take our articles object and replace all the information. So the article 1 content was here. So let's edit this and change article 1's content. Let's do that for article 2. This is the date, 2016 September 10th. So that's going to translate to 2016-09-110. So the format that we use here is year, month, DD. So that's the format in which I've written my date. You can save this as well. Right, so we have 2 articles and we can use that to copy more articles, right? And you can notice that I don't need to restart my app. As soon as I refresh this page, because it fetches the data dynamically from the database, it's getting the value here. Similarly, if I now request for 2, article 2 also loads, right? However, this is not particularly safe, and let's hack this app and see where there is a huge security flaw in our application. So what's happening here is that a SQL query is being generated dynamically according to the value the user enters in the URL. Now, because we should never trust what the user does, the user can actually be smart, and instead of entering a string that we expect is going to be the name of the article, the user can actually enter a different string altogether. For example, what the user can do is put another single quote, right, and put a semicolon, which will end this select query entirely, and then create his own query here. So maybe he can make a delete query here, right? And just to make sure that the query is a valid query, there's another single quote here, so he can do where, and then because this single quote is ending here, right, he just has to make sure that there's a single quote that's available here, right, and then this, when it's joined by our line of code here, it will become a valid SQL query, right? So let's see what happens if we do this. So let's go to articles, let's put a single quote here, right, let's put a space, and let's say delete from articles where a equal to a. Our table name is called article, so delete from article where a equal to a. So notice that I'm putting a single quote here because the other single quote will come from a line of code, right? So let's see what happens if I do this. I need to restart my application. Let's try making that query again, and it says article not found, right? And we don't know why it's saying that, but let's try to go to article 1, and you can see that article 1 is no longer found. And if you go and refresh your database, you can see that all the rows from your database have been deleted, right? So because we trusted the user, and whatever input was given by the user, we just inserted into our own SQL query, the user inserted something malicious and was able to execute an arbitrary SQL query on our database, right? This is unfortunately a very common way that is very easy to protect from, right? But it's a very common way for hackers to make an attack, and they can use that to select data, they can use that to delete data, and they basically have access to our entire database to do what they want, right? So the way to protect ourselves from this, every good library will give us a way of inserting parameters inside our SQL query in a way that the parameter is safe. So for example, what a good library will do is that it will convert our single quote and escape that by putting a backslash, right? So this is what the good library will do. That means that this entire portion will be taken as if it's a title, and this title will be matched, and if no match is found, no article will be shown, right? So let's see how Node Postgres does that. So if you want to see how it does parameterization of queries, you can see here that what they do is they use something like a dollar. So they say $1, and $1 is the first element of an array, right? So what we can do here is that we can say title equal to $1, right? Remove the single quote, and then give the second argument as an array, which will be rect.params.article name, right? And then have the third argument as a function. So this value will now safely be inserted inside our SQL query. So let's save this, right? And let's insert another item here. And let's go to article 1. Now let's try to make the query that we were trying to make, which is delete. And it says article not found, but if I go and refresh this, our article is still there, right? Which means that it's trying to actually search for this string, and it does not find this string as a title, right? Which means that our database access is now safe, right? So this way of using a library to make SQL queries is extremely important. We should never make a query to the database by trusting user input and inserting that into our query, because the user can escape outside our query and then start making random queries to the database. So now once this is done, we can actually go ahead and delete the articles object, right? So we've deleted the articles object, and we've saved quite a few lines of code, and we've made our entire articles data dynamic. In the next module, we'll be looking at how to implement login, logout and user functionality, and how to implement sessions.